The first letter I ever wrote, my daughter said, "You made me the proudest man alive." The last message she sent me said I wasn't invited to the trip I'd spent 3 years building for her mother. Somewhere between those two moments, I stopped being her father and started being her funding source. Welcome back, friends. Pull up a chair. Let me tell you what happened. My wife's name was Eleanor, 41 years married, and I never once heard her complain about a single one of them. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in a 3-block radius and showed up with a casserole before you even knew you needed one. When our neighbor Hank Pruitt lost his job at the mill in 2018, Eleanor quietly paid his electric bill for 4 months through our church's anonymous giving program. I only found out because Pastor Dennis let it slip 2 years later at her memorial. That was Eleanor. She did her best work when no one was watching. She had a thing about Tuscany. Not in a tourist way, not postcards and pasta. Her grandmother, Nonna Rosa, had come over from a village called Monteriggioni in 1951, a young woman with a cardboard suitcase and $40 pinned inside her blouse. Eleanor grew up hearing stories about the stone towers, the smell of cypress trees in August, the particular way the evening light turned the hillsides, the color of old honey. She always said she wanted to stand inside those towers once before she died. Just stand there and feel what Nonna Rosa felt walking away from them. She got sick in the fall of 2022. Ovarian cancer, caught late the way it tends to be. 14 months, start to finish. I was there for every single one of them, every scan, every infusion, every 3 a.m., when the pain got ahead of the medication, and she'd reach over and find my hand in the dark without saying a word. In her last month, lying in the hospital bed we'd had set up in the living room so she could see the backyard, she made me promise. She said, "Take the family to Monteriggioni, all of them. Take our daughter Renee and her husband Marcus and the grandchildren, and go stand inside those towers for me." She said, "Let them see what I saw in my head all those years." I told her I would. I have never broken a promise to Eleanor in 41 years, and I was not about to start while she was still in the room to hear me say it. My name is Gerald Howell. I'm 63 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer for the county of Forsyth in North Carolina before I retired. I am not a dramatic man. I do not raise my voice. I do not make scenes. My daughter Renee used to joke that I processed everything like a loading bar, slow and invisible, and then one day you'd look up and I'd just be done. That's probably accurate. I started planning the trip in January of 2023, 4 months after Eleanor passed. I hired a travel consultant named Dorothy Marsh, a woman out of Winston-Salem who'd been recommended by a friend at church. I told Dorothy what this trip meant. I told her about Monteriggioni, about Nonna Rosa, about Eleanor's 14 months. Dorothy understood immediately. She was the kind of professional who listened the way doctors are supposed to, but mostly don't. Over the next 2.5 years, Dorothy and I built something. A private villa rental outside Siena that could fit the whole family. A guided tour of Monteriggioni on a Tuesday morning when the crowds were thin. A cooking class in a farmhouse kitchen because Eleanor had always wanted to learn to make the real thing, the kind Nonna Rosa used to make from memory with no recipe card. Excursions, restaurant reservations, a private car for the drive from Florence. I paid in installments, the way Dorothy structured it for me, spreading the cost across 26 months. By the time the final accounting came together in the spring of 2025, I had put in just under $42,000. Every dollar of it felt like something I was giving directly to Eleanor. Renee knew the trip was coming. She'd known since the beginning. She and Marcus and their 2 kids, Tyler, who was 9, and Harper, who was 6, were the whole reason I'd booked a villa big enough to sleep 8. We talked about it at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at Easter. It was a fixed point in all of our futures, something solid to walk toward. Her husband Marcus I want to be fair about. He is not a bad man. He is, however, a man who has spent 9 years letting his mother, Phyllis, arrange the emotional furniture of his household. Phyllis lives 40 minutes away in Kernersville, and has a gift for making her preferences sound like everyone else's needs. I had watched that dynamic for years and said nothing because Renee seemed happy enough and it was not my place. It became my place on a Wednesday morning in March of 2025. I was in the garage reorganizing some of Eleanor's gardening things, a project I'd been putting off for 2 years, when my phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Renee. I remember exactly what I was holding, a pair of Eleanor's yellow-handled pruning shears, when I read it. Dad, I need to talk to you about Italy. Marcus and I have been talking, and honestly, so has his mom. She's been saying it feels like a grief trip more than a vacation, and that it might be hard on the kids to have so much heaviness around it. We think it might be better if Marcus and I take the kids somewhere different this summer, something lighter. You should still go if you want. It's just that we think a separate trip would be better for our family. Sorry, Dad. We've had this feeling for a while. I set the phone down on Eleanor's potting bench. I set it down the way you set something down when you need your hands free to deal with what your body is doing. I stood there in the garage for a while looking at the shears. Then I picked the phone back up and called Renee. She answered on the third ring. I could hear Marcus in the background, the television, the ordinary noise of their house. I said, Renee, this trip is for your mother. She said, I know, Dad, but the kids are young, and we just feel like they'd have more fun somewhere with a beach. And Phyllis was saying that it might be confusing for them, emotionally too. I said, your mother made me promise. There was a pause. Then she said, Dad, I know that, but we have to think about what works for our family. I asked her if she had considered what Dorothy had already arranged and paid for. She said, well, that's your decision. You chose to plan it this way. I stood there in the garage for a long time after I hung up. I did not go back inside the house. I sat on the step by the side door where I used to sit in the evenings with Eleanor when the weather was good, and I thought about a woman who had driven a near stranger to dialysis appointments twice a week for 6 years and never mentioned it to a living soul. I thought about Phyllis in Kernersville, arranging the emotional furniture, and something in me that had been a loading bar for 2.5 years finished loading. I did not call Dorothy that afternoon. I sat with it the way Eleanor would have wanted me to, slept on it one night, then another. On the third morning, I drove to my accountant Tom Greer's office and asked him to pull up the full payment history on the Italy trip, $41,840 over 26 months. I sat across from Tom's desk and looked at that number for a while. Then I drove to see my attorney. Her name is Sandra Pruitt, who had handled Eleanor's estate. I told Sandra I wanted to make some changes. Not in anger. I was clear about that with her. I said, Sandy, I'm not doing this hot. I'm doing this clear. There's a difference, and I need you to understand which one this is. The first change, Eleanor's house on Sagebrush Lane, the one we'd bought in 1991, the one where Renee had grown up, where Tyler and Harper still called the back bedroom the princess room, had been left to me outright, with the unspoken understanding that it would eventually pass to Renee. I told Sandra I wanted to list it. I had a buyer in mind already, a young family from the neighborhood who'd slipped a note in our mailbox 8 months earlier, asking if we'd ever consider selling. I'd kept the note in the junk drawer without knowing why, until that morning. The second change was something Eleanor had said to me near the very end. One of those half-asleep things you hold on to because you know you're running out of them. She'd mentioned a woman named Clara Higgins. Clara was a home health aide who had come in 3 mornings a week during Eleanor's last 2 months, and she had a way of making Eleanor laugh even on the bad mornings. A genuine way, not a performance. Eleanor had said to me, that woman is paying for her daughter to go to nursing school out of her own pocket on a home health aide's salary. You find a way to help that girl if you can, Jerry. Promise me. I'd written it down the same night so I wouldn't lose it. Clara's daughter, Josephine, 19 years old, had just been accepted to the nursing program at Wake Forest Baptist. Clara had told me herself when I called her the week after Eleanor died, crying softly, saying Eleanor had been the best patient she ever had. I told Sandra to draft an educational trust in Eleanor's name through our church foundation. The first named recipient, Josephine Higgins, full tuition, room and board, for 4 years of nursing school, not a wedding trust, not money tied to a milestone I could not predict or control. Education, something Eleanor would have called practical love. The third piece was the grandchildren. Tyler and Harper had done nothing wrong. They were 9 and 6. They were innocent of all of it. I told Sandra to write a separate trust for each of them, funded with a portion of the house sale proceeds, to be held and invested until each of them turned 25. Not tied to marriage, not tied to behavior, just waiting for them, growing quietly, for when they were old enough to need it and wise enough to use it. The only clause: if either Renee or Marcus ever attempted to access, redirect, or borrow against either trust before the named beneficiary reached 25, that child's fund would be forfeited entirely to the Nursing Education Foundation. Every dollar, automatically, with no appeal. I told Sandra the same thing I'd told Tom Greer. I am not doing this hot. She looked at me over her reading glasses for a moment and said, I know, Gerald. I can tell. That's why I'm writing it exactly the way you're asking. Now here is the part I have thought about most carefully when I consider how to tell this story honestly. I did not call Renee to tell her about any of it. I did not warn her. I want to be fair to myself about why. It was not cruelty. It was not theater. It was something simpler and harder. She had made a decision about a trip I had spent 3 years and $42,000 building in honor of her mother, and she had made that decision based on what Phyllis thought the emotional tone of a vacation should be, and she had told me that it was my decision how I'd chosen to plan it. So I agreed. It was my decision, and I made mine. The house sold in 19 days to that young family. Cash offer, simple terms. I signed the papers on a Friday afternoon and shook the husband's hand in Sandra's parking lot and wished them well and meant it. I flew to Florence on a Tuesday in June. Alone, except that I was not quite alone. I want to tell you about Ray Costello before I go further, because Ray matters to this story the way Clara matters. Ray was my college roommate at NC State, 53 years ago. He lost his own wife to cancer in 2019, 14 months, almost exactly, same as Eleanor. We had talked almost every week since then in the way that two people talk when they are the only ones who fully understand what the other one is carrying. When I told Ray what Renee had done, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, Jerry, I'm coming with you. I told him he didn't have to. He said, I know I don't have to. That's why I'm doing it. Ray flew in from Cincinnati. We met at the Florence airport and drove together in the private car Dorothy had booked to the villa outside Siena, the one I had never canceled, the one with the terracotta floors and the vineyard view, and a kitchen big enough for the whole family that was now just big enough for 2 old men and a bottle of local wine. On the third morning, Dorothy's guide took us up to Monte Regione. I need to tell you what it looked like, because I think Eleanor deserves for someone to have said it out loud. The towers are older than anything I have ever stood next to. 14 of them, still standing on the ridge, the same stone, the same height as the morning Nana Rosa walked down that hill with a cardboard suitcase in 1951. It was about 9 in the morning and the light was coming in low from the east, and the whole hilltop smelled like dry grass and rosemary and something older than both of those things. I stood inside the wall, and I said Eleanor's name out loud. Ray stood a few feet away, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the valley and giving me whatever room I needed. That was the whole morning. That was the whole trip, really. Everything else was beautiful. That was the thing. My phone buzzed for the first time at about 11 a.m. that same day, while we were walking back down to the car. A text from Renee. Dad, are you in Italy? I did not answer it. I put the phone back in my coat pocket, and Ray and I went to lunch at a place Dorothy had recommended, a family-run spot with 4 tables and a menu written on a chalkboard, and I had the best ribollita I have ever eaten in my life. By the time we were back at the villa that evening, there were 11 texts and 4 missed calls. By the next morning, 22. The messages moved through phases the way they always do. Curious first, then concerned, then something harder. What had happened, as I found out later in pieces, was this. Renee had driven by the house on Sagebrush Lane, just driving by, and noticed unfamiliar cars in the driveway. She'd knocked on the door. The young family answered. The husband, to his credit, was kind. He told Renee he'd bought the house from Gerald Howell in a private sale and that they'd moved in 2 weeks prior. He offered her a glass of water. She did not take it. She called Marcus. Marcus called me 4 times. Then Phyllis, as I understand it, became involved in a more active way. Then Renee called our pastor, who called me once, gently, and I let it go to voicemail, and called him back the next morning to explain calmly what had happened. And Pastor Dennis said, "Gerald, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong." And then he said a short prayer for Eleanor, and we hung up. On the 8th day, Ray and I were sitting on the villa terrace, watching the light change over the vineyard, the kind of evening where you understand for the first time why people have been painting Tuscany for 500 years. And my phone rang with Renee's name on the screen. I looked at it for a moment. Ray looked at me. I picked it up. She started with my name the way she used to when she was small and had broken something. "Dad." Just that, then silence. I said, "Renee." She said, "Did you sell Mom's house?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Without telling me." I said, "You made a decision about your mother's trip without asking me." I figured we were operating on the same understanding about what needed to be discussed first. She was quiet. I could hear her breathing. She said, "Where did the money go?" Her voice had changed. Quieter. Like she already knew it wasn't going where she'd assumed. I told her about the educational trust. I told her Josephine Higgins's name. I told her what her mother had said about Clara in those last weeks. The thing Eleanor had said in the half-asleep way. The way I'd written it down so I wouldn't lose it. Renee was silent for a long time. Then I told her about Tyler and Harper's trusts. I told her the terms. I told her the clause. She said, "Dad, that's not fair to them." I said, "It's the fairest thing I've done in this whole situation. Those two kids are getting something solid that will still be there when they're old enough to use it. What's not fair to them is a grandfather who kept signing checks while their parents decided he was optional." She said, "That's not what we decided." I said, "You texted me that the trip would be better without your family present. On a Wednesday morning in March, while I was holding your mother's pruning shears in the garage. I don't think you thought very hard about what that felt like to read." Another silence. She said, "Phyllis thought." I said, "I know what Phyllis thought. Phyllis has been thinking for your household for 9 years, and I have been patient about that because it wasn't my business. It became my business when her thinking involved a promise I made to your mother from a hospital bed." Renee did not speak for a while. When she did, her voice was different. Not hard. Not soft either. Somewhere in between, the way voices get when someone is working through something they don't have words for yet. She said, "I didn't know you felt that way about Phyllis." I said, "I know you didn't. That's also been a decision I've made, and I own it." I told her I wasn't calling her out to be cruel. I told her I loved her in the matter-of-fact way I had always said it. The way Eleanor used to say, I delivered important things like I was reading from a receipt, flatly and accurately. I told her the grandchildren's trusts were exactly that. Theirs, fully funded, waiting. I told her I had kept the one promise that mattered most. The one I made in that living room with the hospital bed and the backyard view, and that I had kept it alone, which was not how I had planned it, but that I had kept it. She cried then, not performing it, just the real kind, the quiet kind. She said, "I should have come, Dad." I said, "Yes, you should have." We stayed on the phone for a while after that without saying much. Ray had gone inside to give me privacy, and I could see him through the glass door moving around the kitchen, probably making coffee in the way he always made it, badly, with too much water, a habit I had given up correcting 30 years ago. The call ended without a bow on it. No grand resolution, no speech. Just Renee saying she needed to go, and me saying all right, and both of us meaning something by it that we'd have to keep deciding what to do with for a while. I sat on that terrace until the vineyard went dark. I thought about Eleanor, the way she would have handled all of this better than I did, and faster, and with more grace and fewer lawyers. I thought about Nana Rosa walking down that hill in 1951 with $40 and a cardboard suitcase into a future she couldn't see. I thought about Josephine Higgins starting nursing school in the fall, a girl I had never met, who was going to spend her life helping people in hospital beds because her mother had the kind of heart that made Eleanor Howell laugh on the bad mornings. Ray came back out with 2 cups of coffee, terrible as always, and sat down next to me and didn't say anything because Ray has always understood that some evenings don't need commentary. We sat there while the stars came up over Tuscany, the same stars Nana Rosa had looked at from this same ridge before she left, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not healed. I want to be honest with you, friends. Not healed and not finished and not entirely at peace, but done. Done in the specific way that means I had stopped waiting for someone else's permission to take up the space that was mine in this life. Renee calls on Sundays now. We are careful with each other the way people are careful when they know that something broke and they're still figuring out if it can hold weight. Marcus is polite. Phyllis, as far as I can tell, has been quieter in the last few months. I don't know if that will last. Tyler and Harper don't know about any of it yet. They're 9 and 6. They think Grandpa Jerry went to Italy and brought them back soccer jerseys and a jar of honey from a farm on a hillside, which I did, and which was, according to Tyler, extremely cool. That's enough for right now. The trust will still be there when they're 25, when they're old enough to know where it came from and what it cost. And by then I hope they understand that sometimes the most generous thing a person can do is refuse to let what they love be treated like it doesn't matter. I've got a photo on my desk now from that morning in Monteriggioni. Ray took it without telling me. I'm standing inside the old wall with my back to the camera, just looking out over the valley, the towers on either side, the light coming in low. I don't look like a man who just canceled a family vacation and sold a house and rearranged a will. I look like a man standing somewhere he told someone he'd go. That's the part that still surprises me most. Not the decisions, not the logistics. Just that feeling. Standing inside those 1,400-year-old walls on a Tuesday morning with the rosemary smell in the air and the valley spread out below me, saying Eleanor's name out loud to no one and to her at the same time. I kept the promise. Everything else was the consequence of that. If there's someone in your life who has mistaken your steadiness for an absence of limits, friends, I hope this gave you something to think about today. You are allowed to stop absorbing the cost of other people's convenience. You can love someone completely and still refuse to disappear for them. Like this video if that landed. Subscribe if you want more stories like it. And tell me down in the comments, what's one promise you've kept that nobody ever knew about? I'd like to hear it.